The gunshot shattered the desert stillness. Abigail Mason stood frozen on the hilltop, the revolver still smoking in her trembling hand. Below, the body of the kidnapper lay motionless in the dust, his blood darkening the parched earth. The rising sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape, turning everything the color of fire and blood. She had never killed a man before. Beside her, Rosalind Chen knelt in the dirt, her slender frame heaving with exhaustion and horror. Her once pristine blue dress was now torn and stained with dirt, sweat, and blood. Dark hair fell across her face as she stared at the body below. "We have to keep moving," Abigail whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear. "The other two will find him soon." The vastness of the Arizona Territory, 1886, stretched before them, a merciless expanse of rock and scrub beneath the endless sky. Freedom and death seemed equally possible in this unforgiving wilderness. Rosalind's eyes, usually bright with curiosity, now dulled by exhaustion, met Abigail's. "I don't think I can walk anymore, Abby." Abigail holstered the gun, wincing at the bruises around her wrists where the shackles had cut into her flesh. She helped Rosalind to her feet, supporting her weight. "We don't have a choice." Hours earlier, the stagecoach rattled into Copper Creek as the afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings. Dust swirled around the wheels as the driver pulled the horses to a stop outside the town's only hotel. Abigail stepped down, adjusting her simple but well-made traveling dress. She extended a hand to help Rosalind, whose embroidered jacket and careful movements marked her as someone raised with different customs. "We made it," Abigail said, surveying the mining town with cautious optimism. Storefronts lined the main street, and the distant clang of metal on metal echoed from the direction of the mines. Men in work clothes moved with purpose, while a few women hurried along the boardwalks, baskets in hand. Rosalind nodded, her dark eyes taking in every detail. The two women made an unusual pair, Abigail tall and direct with auburn hair pinned severely beneath her hat, Rosalind petite with careful movements and an observant gaze. "The advertisement said to inquire at the Silver Bull Saloon," Rosalind said, checking a folded newspaper clipping in her reticule. "The new textile factory needs women with delicate hands and attention to detail." Abigail frowned. "Let's secure lodging first. I don't like the idea of carrying our belongings around town." After arranging a room at the modest hotel, they made their way toward the saloon. Abigail kept one hand near the small derringer hidden in her pocket, a habit her father had insisted upon during their many research expeditions. "Doctor, I'm out." William Mason had been one of the most respected geologists in the country before his death 3 months ago. The official report claimed heart failure, but Abigail knew better. She had found him in his study, papers scattered, the strongbox broken open. The only thing missing was his notebook containing the coordinates to the Mason crystal deposit, a mineral with extraordinary healing properties that could revolutionize medicine, or become a weapon in the wrong hands. The Silver Bull Saloon smelled of whiskey and sweat. Conversation dimmed as the women entered, and Abigail felt the weight of too many eyes upon them. A man at the bar straightened his vest and approached. His smile revealed a gold tooth, and his eyes never quite met theirs, always sliding just past their shoulders. "Ladies, you must be here about the factory position. I'm Silas Cooper, the hiring agent." He extended a hand that Abigail reluctantly shook. "You're just in time. We're sending the last group of girls out to the site tomorrow morning." "Where exactly is this factory?" Abigail asked, noticing how the barkeep avoided looking in their direction. Cooper's smile widened. "Just across the state line. Brand new facility with modern equipment. The owner is paying top dollar for skilled hands. Room and board provided." Rosalind stepped forward. "I have experience with fine needlework. My father taught me medicinal herbology, but I have always supplemented our income with embroidery and mending." Cooper nodded appreciatively. "And you, miss? What are your skills?" "I assisted my father in his scientific work," Abigail said. "I have steady hands and can follow precise instructions." "Perfect, perfect," Cooper said, a bit too enthusiastically. "The wagon leaves at dawn. Meet behind the general store. Bring only what you can carry." As they walked back to their hotel room, Rosalind's excitement was palpable. "This could be a fresh start for both of us, Abby." Abigail wasn't convinced. "Something feels wrong. Why would a textile factory be built so far from a railroad or city?" Rosalind touched her arm gently. Not everyone has ulterior motives. After what happened to your father, it's understandable you're cautious. But we need this opportunity. Abigail nodded, though the unease remained. Since meeting Rosalind on the stagecoach 2 days ago, she'd grown fond of the young woman. Rosalind had fled San Francisco after her father's traditional medicine shop was destroyed in a fire, another suspicious tragedy that left her alone in the world. That night, Abigail slept with her father's silver hairpin clutched in her hand and the crystal pendant hidden beneath her nightdress, the only piece of the miraculous mineral she had managed to save. The surface was etched with coordinates in a code only she understood, her father's final gift and burden. The wagon turned out to be a covered transport with small, barred windows. Two other young women were already inside when Abigail and Rosalind arrived at dawn. Before they could reconsider, Cooper and two other men ushered them aboard. Just a precaution, Cooper explained as one of the men, younger with a lean, hungry look, checked their bags. The route passes through dangerous territory. We'll keep you safe inside. As the wagon lurched forward, Abigail met the eyes of the other women, one barely more than a girl, the other middle-aged with a resigned expression. Neither spoke. It was only when they were an hour outside of town that Cooper, riding alongside the driver, called back through a small opening. Get comfortable, ladies. It's a 2-day journey to the border. Border? Abigail stood, her head nearly touching the canvas roof. You said the factory was across the state line. Cooper laughed. Did I? Must have misspoken. It's across the border, in Mexico. The younger man, who had introduced himself as Ray, grinned from his horse. Don't worry. The boss pays well for fresh stock. Ice formed in Abigail's stomach as the truth crystallized. This was no textile factory. They were being trafficked. By mid-afternoon, the other women had been drugged with laudanum-laced water. Abigail had pretended to drink, spilling most of it down her dress. Rosalind, following her lead, had done the same. Now they sat silent as the wagon bumped along, the desert heat turning the interior into an oven. We have to get out of here, Abigail whispered, her lips barely moving. Rosalind's eyes darted to the small window where Ray occasionally peered in. How? Abigail carefully worked her sleeve up, revealing her father's silver hairpin tucked into a seam. When night falls, be ready. As dusk approached, the wagon stopped in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a creek. The men built a fire and passed a bottle between them, their voices growing louder with each drink. Ray opened the back of the wagon, grabbing a canteen of water. Thirsty? He asked, eyes lingering on Rosalind. Please, Abigail said, adding a note of desperation to her voice. And we need to relieve ourselves. Ray considered this, then nodded. One at a time. Try to run, and I'll put a bullet in your friend's head. He took Rosalind first, keeping a firm grip on her arm as he led her into the bushes. When they returned, Rosalind's face was pale, her lip bleeding. Abigail felt rage course through her veins as Ray grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He led her to a cluster of scrub brush just out of sight of the camp. Hurry up, he said, turning his back but keeping his hand on his pistol. Abigail quickly relieved herself, mind racing. As they walked back, Ray's hand slid down to her waist. Maybe we should make sure you girls are worth the trouble, he said, breath hot against her neck. The boss would never know. Abigail forced herself to look into his eyes. Wait, we're taking it off. Ray froze, confusion crossing his face. What? You don't have to hurt us, she continued, voice trembling but maintaining eye contact. We'll cooperate. Just let us go afterward. For a moment, he seemed startled by her directness. Then he laughed, a harsh sound in the gathering darkness. You think I want it? You're not for me. You're for the buyer. He shoved her toward the wagon. Besides, damaged goods don't fetch his mo. Back in the wagon, Abigail held Rosalind close as darkness fell. The men's voices grew slurred, their laughter more erratic. Eventually they fell silent, succumbing to drink and exhaustion. Now, Abigail whispered, carefully extracting the hairpin from her sleeve. The lock on the wagon door was simple but sturdy. With fingers made steady by desperation, Abigail worked the pin into the mechanism, feeling for the tumblers as her father had once shown her, just in case, he'd said, never explaining what emergency he anticipated. Minutes stretched into an eternity until finally the lock gave way with a soft click. "Stay close to me," Abigail whispered, easing the door open slowly to minimize creaking. They slipped out into the night, the desert air cool against their skin after the stifling wagon. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the sleeping forms of their captors. Cooper and the third man, Martinez, were sprawled by the fire. Ray had taken first watch but had succumbed to the whiskey, slumped against a tree. Rosalind pointed silently to Ray's holster. The gun was still there. Abigail hesitated only a moment before creeping toward him. Each step felt impossibly loud, each breath a potential alarm. When her fingers closed around the cold metal of the revolver, she nearly gasped with relief. They backed away slowly, then turned and ran into the darkness, away from the road, into the wild heart of the desert. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs trembled, the only sound their ragged breathing and the soft crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. Thorns tore at their dresses, stones bruised their feet through thin soles, but the fear of what lay behind drove them forward. "Don't stop," Abigail gasped when Rosalind stumbled. "We can't stop." The desert at night was a different world, cold, vast, and filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The moon provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, but not enough to reveal a path or destination. They followed a dry wash, reasoning that it might eventually lead to water. After what felt like hours, Rosalind collapsed behind a large boulder. "Just a moment," she pleaded, chest heaving. "Chest. I can't." Abigail knelt beside her, listening intently for pursuit. The desert was silent except for the whisper of wind through the scrub. "We should be safe until dawn," she said, though she had no way of knowing if it was true. "Rest, but we move again at first light." Rosalind nodded, curling against the rock for what little shelter it provided. "How did you know? About the wagon, I mean." Abigail's hand went instinctively to the crystal pendant hidden beneath her bodice. "My father had enemies. He taught me to recognize danger." "What did your father do that earned him such enemies?" Abigail was silent for a moment, weighing how much to share. "He discovered something valuable, something people would kill for." Rosalind's eyes widened in the moonlight. "Is that why you're heading west? To escape these people?" "To protect what he found," Abigail corrected, "and to ensure it's used as he intended. To heal, not to harm." She didn't elaborate, and Rosalind didn't press. Instead, they huddled together against the desert chill, taking turns to watch and doze until the eastern sky began to lighten. With the first gray light of dawn, they continued their journey, now able to see the harsh landscape around them. The terrain was transitioning from rocky foothills to a flatter, more exposed plain, with scattered patches of brittle grass and low-growing cacti. "Look," Rosalind said suddenly, pointing to a distant smudge on the horizon. "Could that be water? Or a town?" Before Abigail could answer, the sound they'd been dreading cut through the morning stillness. Hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind them. "Run!" Abigail grabbed Rosalind's hand, pulling her forward. But they were exhausted, dehydrated, and in open terrain with little cover. The rider gained ground rapidly. Soon Abigail could make out Ray's lean form, his face contorted with rage as he urged his horse faster. "There!" She pointed to a small rise topped with boulders. "We can make a stand there." They scrambled up the slope, loose stones sliding beneath their feet. At the top, Abigail positioned Rosalind behind the largest boulder, then checked the revolver. 5 bullets remained. "Stay down," she ordered, taking position with a clear view of the approaching rider. Ray reined in his horse at the base of the rise, dismounting with his gun already drawn. "You stupid bitches," he shouted. "Do you know what Cooper's gonna do when he catches up? Make you wish you were never born." He started up the slope, keeping low. Abigail steadied her breathing, remembering her father's lessons at the shooting range. "Wait until you have a clear shot," he'd always said. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger." Ray darted between boulders, working his way up. "I see you there," he called. "Make this easy on yourselves." When he was 30 feet away, he made his move, rushing forward with his gun raised. Abigail fired. The bullet caught him in the chest. Ray staggered, a look of stunned disbelief crossing his face before he collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto the stony ground. The gunshot echoed across the landscape, then faded into the vast silence of the desert. Abigail didn't move, the gun still trained on Ray's motionless form. She had never killed before. The knowledge of what she'd done settled into her bones like a cold weight. Beside her, Rosalind was shaking uncontrollably. Is he? Yes. Abigail's voice sounded distant to her own ears. They remained frozen for several minutes until Abigail finally lowered the gun. We need to keep moving. The shot might attract attention. Mechanically, she checked Ray's pockets, finding a few dollars, a pocket knife, and a folded paper. She opened it to reveal a crudely drawn map with a location marked delivery point. In the corner was a stamp. Approved, N. Blackwood. The name sent a chill through her. Nathaniel Blackwood, the man who had offered her father a fortune for the Mason crystal, then threatened him when he refused to sell. Abby? Rosalind's voice pulled her back to the present. What is it? Confirmation of who we're dealing with, she said grimly, pocketing the map. We need to move. And so they found themselves at dawn's edge, Abigail standing with a smoking gun, while Rosalind knelt in the dust, both staring at the body of their would-be captor. We have to keep moving, Abigail repeated, helping Rosalind to her feet. They continued toward the smudge on the horizon, hoping for water, shelter, or any sign of civilization friendly to two desperate women. The sun rose higher, beating down with merciless intensity. Their pace slowed as exhaustion and thirst took their toll. By mid-morning, Rosalind could barely walk. Her lips were cracked, her eyes unfocused. Abigail supported her as best she could, but her own strength was failing. Just a little further, she encouraged, though she had no idea what lay ahead. When Rosalind finally collapsed, Abigail had no choice but to stop. She eased her friend into the meager shade of a scrubby mesquite and looked around desperately. The landscape shimmered with heat, offering nothing but more rock, more dust, more emptiness. Abigail held Rosalind's hand, feeling the weak pulse in her wrist. This was her fault. She had drawn Rosalind into her dangerous world, and now they would both die in this wasteland. She touched the crystal pendant at her throat, feeling its subtle warmth. The pendant that had cost her father his life. The secret she had sworn to protect. Memory washed over her father's study 3 months ago, his face gaunt but his eyes alive with excitement as he showed her the crystal. This will change everything, Abby, he'd said, holding the translucent stone to the light. The healing properties are beyond anything in modern medicine. Wounds close in hours instead of weeks. Infections vanish. It could save thousands of soldiers, children, mothers. Then why not announce it? She'd asked. Why the secrecy? His expression had darkened. Because in the wrong hands, it becomes something else. Imagine an army that can't be stopped because their wounds heal instantly. Imagine the power someone would have controlling who lives and who dies. He'd pressed the crystal into her palm. I've been offered fortunes for this by men who would use it for terrible purposes. We must protect it until I can publish my findings through proper scientific channels. A week later, he was dead. The house ransacked, and Abigail was fleeing east with the last sample and the encoded coordinates to the deposit. Now, as she cradled Rosalind in the desert heat, his final words echoed in her mind. Promise me, Abby. Promise you'll never give up. I won't let you down, she whispered, to both her father's memory and the unconscious woman beside her. I won't give up. She stood on shaky legs, scanning the horizon one more time. That's when she saw it, a figure approaching from the distant smudge they had been heading toward. A person leading a horse, carrying what looked like a bucket. Abigail's hand moved to the gun, but she hesitated. Friend or foe? Salvation or another threat? As the figure drew closer, she could make out a man, tall, weathered, with a wide-brimmed hat shading his face. He wore a simple cotton shirt, faded denim, and dust-covered boots. The metal bucket he carried caught the sunlight, revealing what she most desperately needed, water. The man stopped about 30 feet away, studying them with careful eyes. No words, no smile, just a long, unreadable stare. Abigail kept the gun half hidden in the folds of her skirt, ready. We need water, she called, her voice cracking from thirst. The man didn't move at first. Then slowly he approached, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He stopped about 10 feet away, setting the bucket down. You ladies look like you've had a rough time, he said, his voice deep and even. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. "Water, please," Abigail repeated, too exhausted for caution. The man nodded once. "Help yourselves. It's fresh from the well." Abigail maintained her grip on the gun as she pulled Rosalind into a sitting position. "Rose, wake up. Water." Rosalind's eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort on the bucket. The man stepped back, giving them space as Abigail helped Rosalind drink, then took several desperate swallows herself. The water was cool and clean, bringing immediate relief. "Thank you," Abigail said when they had quenched the worst of their thirst. The man nodded again. "Name's Calvin Montgomery. My ranch is about a mile that way." He gestured toward the direction he'd come from. "I'm Abigail Mason. This is Rosalind Chen." Calvin's eyes took in their torn dresses, the bruises on their wrists, the exhaustion in their faces. "You running from someone?" Before Abigail could formulate a cautious response, Rosalind spoke. "3 men. They lied to us, said we'd have work at a factory, then they tied us up in a wagon." Calvin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked toward the direction they had come, then back to them. "Where are these men now?" Abigail hesitated. "One's dead. I shot him when he came after us. The others will be looking." If Calvin was shocked by this admission, he didn't show it. He simply nodded as if she'd told him about the weather. "Can your friend walk? My ranch isn't far." "I can walk," Rosalind said, struggling to her feet with Abigail's help. Calvin watched them for a moment, then made a decision. "Wait here, I'll bring the horse around. No sense in you walking when you're half dead from thirst." As he turned to retrieve his horse, the sound of hoofbeats erupted from the direction they had fled. A rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky. Even at a distance, Abigail recognized Cooper's bulky frame. Calvin heard it too. In one smooth motion, he drew a revolver from his hip holster and positioned himself between the women and the approaching rider. Cooper pulled his horse to a sharp halt when he saw the tableau before him, the 2 women he was hunting and a stranger with a gun drawn. His shirt was unbuttoned, his face flushed with rage or exertion, or both. His eyes locked on to Calvin. "You got something of mine?" he called, hand hovering near his own weapon. Calvin's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "Don't reckon I do." Cooper swung down from his saddle, drawing his gun as his feet hit the ground. "Back off. Those 2 belong to me." The words hit like a physical blow. Rosalind gasped, shrinking against Abigail, who raised her own gun. But Calvin moved faster. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, aimed, and fired. The shot cracked across the open plain like thunder. Cooper screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his shoulder as blood soaked through his shirt. He fell to one knee, face contorted in pain and disbelief. Calvin walked forward, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He kept his gun trained on Cooper as he approached. "No one owns anybody out here." He kicked Cooper's fallen gun away, then emptied the chambers, letting the bullets fall into the dust. "You tell your friends," he said, voice still even but carrying an unmistakable threat. "If they come for these women, they answer to me." Cooper glared up at him, hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Neither do you." Calvin stepped back. "Now get on your horse and ride. Don't let me see you again." Cooper struggled to his feet, backing toward his horse with a mixture of hate and fear in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat as he mounted awkwardly, one hand still pressed to his wound. Calvin watched silently as Cooper rode away, then turned back to Abigail and Rosalind. For the first time, his expression softened slightly. "My ranch is just over that rise," he said, holstering his gun. "You can rest there. Figure out your next move when you're not half dead." Abigail studied him carefully. This stranger had just risked his life for them without hesitation. Either he was remarkably noble, or he had reasons of his own for confronting men like Cooper. "Why help us?" she asked, still keeping a cautious distance. Something flickered across Calvin's weathered face, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Then after a pause, "And because I've seen what happens when no one steps in." He didn't elaborate, and Abigail didn't press. For now, they needed shelter, food, and safety. The questions could wait. "Thank you," she said, helping Rosalind toward Calvin's waiting horse. "We accept your offer." As Calvin helped them mount and began leading the horse toward his ranch, Abigail felt the weight of the crystal pendant against her skin. She had escaped one danger only to potentially walk into another. But something about Calvin Montgomery's steady presence gave her hope, the first real hope she'd felt since her father's death. What she couldn't know was that Calvin carried his own burdens, his own ghosts, and that the paths that had brought them all to this moment in the desert were more intertwined than any of them could imagine. The sun climbed higher as they crested the rise, revealing a small ranch nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. A simple wooden house, a weathered barn, a corral with a few horses, and a windmill turning slowly in the morning breeze. To Abigail and Rosalind, after the horrors of the past days, it looked like salvation itself. But as they approached, Abigail, though, couldn't help wondering, how long would this sanctuary last? Cooper knew where they were, and somewhere out there, Nathaniel Blackwood was waiting, hunting for the secret she carried. The desert had granted them a reprieve, but the echoes of danger still lingered on the horizon, waiting to return with the setting sun. Calvin Montgomery's ranch appeared deceptively simple from a distance, but as they drew closer, Abigail noticed the careful thought behind its construction. The house sat on a slight rise, offering a clear view in all directions. The windows were narrow, positioned to allow those inside to see out while providing minimal targets for anyone outside. The corral and barn were arranged to create a natural defensive perimeter. This wasn't just a homestead, it was a fortress disguised as a ranch. Solitude, Calvin said, noticing her appraising gaze. That's what I call this place. Appropriate, Abigail murmured. He helped Rosalind dismount first, supporting her weight as her knees buckled. Abigail climbed down on her own, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. 3 days of fear, minimal water, and no real food had taken their toll. The interior of the house was cool and dim after the harsh sunlight. Simple furnishings, a table with 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with a rocking chair beside it, shelves lined with books and practical items. Everything was clean and organized with military precision. Calvin showed them to a small bedroom with a single bed. "You can rest here," he said, his deep voice softening slightly. "There's a bar that locks the door from the inside." He demonstrated the heavy wooden beam that slid into metal brackets. "If it helps you sleep better." The gesture, understanding their need for security without them having to ask, touched Abigail unexpectedly. "I'll fetch some clean clothes and heat water for washing," he continued. "There's food when you're ready." After he left, closing the door behind him, Abigail and Rosalind exchanged a look of cautious relief. "Can we trust him?" Rosalind whispered, sinking onto the edge of the bed. Abigail slid the wooden bar into place, securing the door. "For now, we don't have much choice." She checked the window, small but a possible escape route if needed. "But keep your guard up. Men don't live alone in the desert without reasons." Calvin returned with 2 sets of clothes, cotton shirts and trousers that would be too large but clean, and a basin of warm water. He passed these through the door without entering, respecting their privacy in a way their kidnappers never had. Rosalind went first, washing away days of grime and terror. As Abigail helped clean the cuts on her friend's back where Ray had struck her, she felt rage resurface. She didn't regret killing him. The realization should have disturbed her more than it did. When it was her turn, Abigail removed her tattered dress, careful to keep the crystal pendant around her neck. She washed quickly, efficiently, then dressed in the oversized clothes Calvin had provided. The sleeves of the shirt needed to be rolled several times, and the trousers were held up by a piece of rope, but the clean fabric felt like armor against her skin. By the time they emerged, Calvin had prepared a simple meal: beans, cornbread, and coffee. He didn't press them with questions as they ate, giving them space to regain their strength. Finally, when the edge had been taken off their hunger, Abigail looked up to find Calvin studying her with those steady eyes. "Thank you," she said formally, "for the food, the clothes, for intervening with Cooper." Calvin nodded once. "You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to move on, or longer if you need." "Why?" Abigail challenged, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. "You don't know us. We could be outlaws for all you know." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Are you? Outlaws?" "No, but you had no way of knowing that." Calvin leaned back in his chair, considering her for a long moment. "I've lived out here long enough to recognize the difference between people running from the law and people running for their lives." His gaze shifted to include Rosalind. "You two are the latter." Rosalind spoke up. "Those men, they told us they were hiring for a textile factory, but they were taking us to Mexico, to sell us." Her voice trembled slightly. Calvin's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the weathered skin. "It happens more often than folks want to admit. There are men who make their fortune trading in human misery." Something in his tone made Abigail look closer. There was knowledge in his words, an old pain. "You've encountered this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Calvin met her gaze directly. "Yes." He didn't elaborate, and Abigail didn't press. Instead, she asked, "Will Cooper come back?" "Probably, not alone." "Then we should leave," Abigail said, though the thought of returning to the desert made her stomach clench. "We've brought danger to your door." Calvin shook his head. "Danger was already here. Has been for years." He stood gathering the empty plates. "Rest. Regain your strength. We'll talk more tomorrow." That night, despite their exhaustion, sleep came fitfully to Abigail. She kept the gun Calvin had returned to her under her pillow, her hand never far from it. Beside her, Rosalind slept the deep sleep of the utterly depleted. Through the thin walls, Abigail could hear Calvin moving about the house, checking doors, windows, the soft clink of metal that might have been weapons being cleaned. The sounds were oddly reassuring. Before dawn, she finally drifted into deeper sleep, only to dream of her father's study, papers scattered across the floor, and blood, so much blood, soaking into the Persian carpet her mother had loved. Morning light filtered through the small window, casting a golden rectangle on the rough wooden floor. Abigail woke instantly alert, a habit formed over months of constant vigilance. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The unfamiliar ceiling, the sound of distant horses. Then memory returned in a rush. The escape, the desert, Calvin Montgomery's ranch. Safety, at least for now. And as consciousness fully returned, so did the nightmare that had awoken her. Her father's study, that terrible night 3 months ago. The memory was so vivid she could still smell the copper tang of blood. She had returned home late, having delivered some geological samples to her father's colleague across town. The house had been unnaturally quiet. No lamp burned in the front window, though her father always left one lit when she was out after dark. "Father," she had called, lighting a lamp in the hallway. No answer came, but something else raised the hairs on her neck, the faint scrape of a drawer closing upstairs. Instinct made her reach for the small derringer her father insisted she carry. Silently, she climbed the stairs, dread building with each step. Her father's study door stood ajar, a thin line of light spilling onto the hall carpet. She pushed it open slowly. The scene seared itself permanently into her memory. Her father slumped across his desk, blood pooling beneath him. Papers scattered everywhere. The strongbox where he kept his most valuable research lying open and empty. A movement to her right, a man in a dark coat slipping toward the balcony doors. She had raised the derringer, fired without thinking. The man had cried out, clutching his arm, but hadn't fallen. Instead, he'd vaulted over the balcony rail into the darkness. She had rushed to her father, desperately searching for a pulse, finding none. His final words to her that morning echoed in her mind. "Remember, Abby, some discoveries are too important to belong to any one person or any one organization." It was only later, after the police had come and gone with their perfunctory investigation, that she discovered her father had hidden his most important secret. Not in the strongbox the intruder had emptied, but with her. The crystal pendant had been tucked into her own jewelry box with a note. "For Abby, guard this well." Rosalind stirred beside her, pulling Abigail back to the present. Her friend's face was peaceful in sleep, the bruises on her wrists the only visible reminder of their ordeal. Abigail slipped quietly from the bed, dressed, and secured the crystal pendant beneath her borrowed shirt. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Calvin at the table cleaning a rifle with methodical precision. His hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. He looked up, nodding a greeting. "Coffee's hot." Abigail poured herself a cup, noting that Calvin had positioned himself with a clear view of all entrances to the house. Another soldier's habit. "You were in the war," she said, sitting across from him. Calvin's hands paused briefly in their work. "What makes you say that?" The way you handle weapons, the way you positioned yourself when Cooper approached, the layout of your ranch. She took a sip of coffee. My father worked with the Union Army, developing more accurate field maps. I grew up around soldiers. Calvin studied her with new interest, then resumed cleaning the rifle. Major 5th Cavalry Regiment, Union Army, reconnaissance unit. You saw action, more than I care to remember. Abigail nodded, understanding the weight behind those simple words. She had met many veterans growing up, men who carried invisible wounds alongside their physical scars. And after the war, she asked? Texas Rangers for a time. Then, he hesitated. This. He reassembled the rifle with swift, practiced movements, his hands telling the story his words avoided. These were not the hands of a simple rancher. They belonged to a man who had lived by his wits and reflexes. Your leg, Abigail said carefully. Gettysburg? Calvin looked up sharply. How did you know? The way you favor it. And Gettysburg saw some of the worst cavalry casualties. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Observant, yes. Many a ball shattered the bone above the knee. Doctors wanted to take the leg. The smile vanished. I had other ideas. It still pains you. Some days more than others. He set the reassembled rifle aside. Your friend, Miss Chen, she noticed too, offered some kind of herbal remedy, said her father was a healer. He was, Abigail confirmed. Rosalind knows more about healing than most doctors with fancy degrees. You should let her help. Calvin's expression remained noncommittal. He changed the subject. Your friend needs rest, but you look strong enough. Would you mind helping with some chores? Sitting idle doesn't suit me, and I'm guessing it doesn't suit you either. Abigail recognized the deflection but accepted it. I'd be glad to help. They spent the morning tending to the small herd of horses in the corral, repairing a section of fence, and checking the windmill that pumped water from the deep well beneath the ranch. Calvin worked steadily, speaking little but instructing Abigail when necessary. As they worked, Abigail found herself studying him more carefully. He moved with the grace of a man comfortable in his body, despite the slight favor he showed his left leg. A war injury, she guessed. His face was lined by sun and experience, but she revised her initial estimate of his age downward, perhaps early 40s rather than older. More intriguing were the contradictions. His hands were calloused from ranch work, but they handled tools with surprising delicacy. His speech was simple but precise, suggesting education. And occasionally, when he thought she wasn't looking, a profound sadness crossed his features. By midday, when they returned to the house for water, Rosalind was awake. She had taken the initiative to prepare a simple meal from supplies in Calvin's pantry. I hope you don't mind, she said, looking uncertainly at their host. I wanted to contribute something. Not at all, Calvin replied, something in his demeanor softening as he washed his hands in a basin by the door. Been a long time since anyone cooked in this kitchen but me. As they ate, Rosalind asked, How long have you lived here, Mr. Montgomery? 7 years, and it's just Calvin. Do you have family nearby? Rosalind continued, her natural warmth drawing him out in a way Abigail's direct questions hadn't. A shadow passed over Calvin's face. No. Sensing she'd touched a nerve, Rosalind changed the subject. I noticed you have quite a collection of books. Are you fond of reading? This safer topic brought a slight easing to Calvin's expression. Gets quiet out here. Books help pass the winter months. After the meal, Calvin excused himself to check the perimeter of the property, a precaution, he explained, that he took several times daily. Once he was gone, Rosalind turned to Abigail. He's carrying something heavy, she observed, something that shaped his entire life. Abigail nodded, impressed once again by Rosalind's perceptiveness. Yes, but then, aren't we all? Rosalind's dark eyes studied her. What's your plan, Abby? We can't stay here forever. Abigail touched the hidden pendant beneath her shirt. I need to get to San Francisco. There's a colleague of my father's there, someone I can trust with his research. After that, she shook her head. I don't know. San Francisco. Rosalind's voice held a mixture of longing and pain. I can never go back there. Because of the fire? Rosalind nodded. The fire was no accident. My father had enemies, people who resented his success, who called his medicine heathen practices. But it was more than that, she hesitated. The night before the fire, a man came to the shop, well-dressed, educated. He asked my father about rare herbs, ones with unusual properties, healing properties beyond normal medicine. Abigail felt a chill. What was this man's name? He didn't give one, but later I found a card he'd left. It had a symbol, a rising sun with a sword through it, and the words New Dawn Society. The air seemed to thicken around them. Rosalind, what exactly did your father do? Beyond traditional medicine? He was known for being able to identify and blend herbs that could accelerate healing. Remedies that could close wounds in days rather than weeks. Stop infections when Western doctors had given up. Rosalind met her gaze directly. People called it magic. It wasn't. It was knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge that some would kill for. The parallels were too specific to be coincidence. Abigail made a decision. I need to show you something, and something you can't tell anyone else, not even Calvin. She drew out the crystal pendant from beneath her shirt. In the midday light streaming through the window, it seemed to glow from within, not simply reflecting light, but somehow enhancing it. Rosalind's breath caught. What is it? My father called it the Mason crystal. It's a mineral he discovered in a remote deposit near the border. It has properties, healing properties beyond anything in modern medicine. Abigail held it between them. When ground into a fine powder and applied to wounds, it accelerates healing exponentially. Wounds that should take weeks to close heal in hours. Infections disappear overnight. Rosalind stared at the crystal, recognition dawning in her eyes. My father spoke of such things, minerals that could amplify the effects of medicinal herbs 100-fold. He thought they were just legends. They're real and dangerous in the wrong hands. Abigail tucked the pendant back into her shirt. My father was killed for this, for refusing to sell it to men who would use it for power instead of healing. Men like the one who came to our shop, Rosalind whispered. The one who left the card with the rising sun. I think so. Abigail leaned closer. Rosalind, the man who orchestrated my father's murder, was named Nathaniel Blackwood. Does that name mean anything to you? Rosalind shook her head. No, but... She stopped as the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them. Abigail moved to the window, peering cautiously through the narrow opening. A single rider was approaching from the east, not the direction Cooper had fled. Someone's coming, she said, reaching for the gun she'd kept close. The door opened, and Calvin stepped in, rifle in hand. Stay inside, he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Away from the windows. He positioned himself by the door, watching through a small gap as the rider approached. Abigail and Rosalind moved to the far wall, Abigail keeping her body between Rosalind and the door, gun ready. The tension in the small house was palpable as the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped outside. A man's voice called out, Montgomery, you in there. It's Daniel Webb. Calvin's posture relaxed slightly, though he kept the rifle ready. Deputy Webb, he said, loud enough to be heard outside. What brings you out this way? Official business. Mind if I come in out of this sun? Calvin glanced at Abigail and Rosalind, giving a subtle nod to indicate they should remain hidden. Come ahead, he called, opening the door wider. A man in a dust-covered duster entered, badge glinting on his chest. Deputy Daniel Webb was in his early 40s, with a weather-beaten face and calculating eyes that took in every detail of the room. Been a while, Montgomery, he said, removing his hat. Ranch looks good. What can I do for you, Deputy? Calvin asked, keeping the conversation focused. Webb hooked his thumbs in his belt. Looking for two women, young, one tall with auburn hair, one Chinese. They're wanted for questioning in a murder over in Copper Creek. Thought you might have seen them, being as you're the only ranch between here and there. Abigail felt her heart pounding against her ribs. The law was already involved, which meant Cooper had reported Ray's death, likely with a fabricated story making her and Rosalind the villains. Haven't seen anyone, Calvin said, his expression giving nothing away. Been busy with the south fence line the past couple days. Only got back late yesterday. Webb studied him, clearly weighing the truth of his words. Mind if I look around, just to be thorough? I do mind, Calvin replied evenly. You got a warrant, Webb? A tense silence followed. Webb's hand drifted closer to his holster. You know, for a man who values his privacy, you're awfully quick to turn down a simple request from the law. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding. Nothing but my right not to have my home invaded without cause. Calvin hadn't moved, but something in his stance suggested readiness. Now, I've answered your question. If there's nothing else, I've got work to do. Webb's eyes narrowed. You always were a difficult bastard, Montgomery. That's why you never lasted with the Rangers. He settled his hat back on his head. I'll be back, with papers, if needed. You do that. Webb turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Word of advice, Montgomery. These women, they're mixed up with some powerful people. The kind you don't want to cross. If you see them, turn them in, for your own good. After he left, the three of them remained silent until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did Calvin lower his rifle. He knows, Abigail said flatly. Or suspects. Calvin nodded. Webb's smarter than he looks, and he's in someone's pocket. Cooper's? Higher than Cooper. Calvin moved to the window, watching the retreating figure. Webb doesn't stick his neck out unless there's real money or power behind it. Rosalind looked between them, fear evident in her eyes. What does this mean? Will he come back with more men? Eventually, Calvin turned to face them, but not today. He'll need to get authorization, gather men. We have some time. We should leave, Abigail said. This isn't your fight. Calvin's expression hardened. Webb mentioned powerful people. Who exactly are you running from, Miss Mason? The direct question caught her off guard. She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. A man named Nathaniel Blackwood. He had my father killed over a scientific discovery. Recognition flashed in Calvin's eyes, followed by something darker. Nathaniel Blackwood, he repeated, the name like gravel in his mouth. Head of the New Dawn Society. It was Abigail's turn to be surprised. You know him? Calvin crossed to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. From inside, he withdrew a folded paper and handed it to her. Abigail opened it to find a wanted poster. Nathaniel Blackwood's aristocratic features stared back at her, handsome in a cold way, with piercing eyes and a meticulously trimmed beard. The charges listed included multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and suspected murder. The reward was substantial. This is 7 years old, she noted, checking the date. He's been wanted a long time. But he's protected. Has friends in high places, money in all the right pockets. Calvin's voice was flat. The New Dawn Society operates under the guise of a legitimate mining company. In reality, they're more like a cult. Blackwood convinces wealthy, powerful men to join by promising them something they all want. More power, longer life, control over death itself. The Mason crystal, Abigail whispered. Calvin's gaze sharpened. What? She glanced at Rosalind, who gave a small nod of encouragement. Abigail made a decision and drew out the pendant. This is what my father discovered, what Blackwood wanted. She explained the crystal's properties, watching Calvin's expression shift from skepticism to grim understanding. And Blackwood knows you have this? He knows I escaped with my father's research. He may not know about this specific sample, but he knows I have the location of the deposit. She touched the surface of the crystal where the coordinates were etched in her father's code. That's what he really wants, an endless supply. Calvin was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. Finally, he spoke. Blackwood ordered the murder of my wife and son 7 years ago. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. He wanted this land. There's a silver vein running beneath it. Valuable, but not his real interest. This ranch sits at a strategic location, controlling access to a hidden valley beyond those hills. He nodded toward the western window. I refused to sell. While I was away on ranger business, his men came. They killed Elizabeth and James. Burned our first house to the ground. Rosalind made a small sound of distress. Your wife and child, I'm so sorry. Calvin acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, but continued, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. I've been hunting his organization ever since. One by one, I've found the men responsible for carrying out his orders. But Blackwood himself stays hidden, protected. That's why you built this place like a fortress, Abigail realized. Why you live alone out here? I'm waiting for him to make another bow for the land. He will, eventually. And when he does, Calvin left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. The room fell silent as the three of them absorbed the connections between their separate tragedies, all leading back to one man and his obsession with power. Webb works for him, Abigail said finally. That's what you meant about him being in someone's pocket. Calvin nodded. Many local officials do. Whether they know it or not, Blackwood's influence runs deep in these territories. Then we truly need to leave, Rosalind insisted. We've put you in even more danger. No, Calvin's response was immediate. This is the safest place for you right now. Webb will be watching the roads. The stagecoach stops. And if Blackwood connects you to what happened in Copper Creek, he'll have men looking for you at every turn. He moved to the window again, his profile silhouetted against the afternoon light. Besides, it seems we have a common enemy and a common cause. The implications of his words settled over them. Abigail felt something shift inside her. The lonely burden she had carried since her father's death suddenly shared, if only partially. I need to check the horses, Calvin said, moving toward the door. Think about what I've said. We'll talk more later. After he left, Rosalind turned to Abigail. Do you believe him? About his wife and son? Yes, Abigail's response was immediate. That kind of pain can't be fabricated, and it explains so much about him, why he lives out here alone, why he was so quick to help us against Cooper. What do we do now? Rosalind asked, her practical nature asserting itself. Stay or go? Abigail touched the crystal pendant thoughtfully. For now, we stay. Calvin's right. This is the safest place until we figure out our next move. And, she hesitated, I think he needs this as much as we do. Needs what? A chance to fight back. To do more than just wait and remember. As afternoon faded into evening, Abigail found Calvin in the barn, methodically brushing down his horse. His movements were gentle but efficient, speaking to years of practice and genuine care for the animal. She watched him silently for a moment, noting how the horse leaned into his touch, trusting completely. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, tenderness beneath the hardened exterior. His name is Sergeant, Calvin said without turning, aware of her presence. Been with me since the war. Abigail approached slowly, letting the horse become accustomed to her scent. He's beautiful. Stubborn, loyal to a fault. Calvin ran a hand along the horse's neck, carried me off more battlefields than I care to remember. She noticed his limp seemed more pronounced in the uneven floor of the stall. Calvin caught her glance and grimaced. Old wound acts up in the damp. Something about the barometric pressure, according to the field surgeon. He patted Sergeant's flank. This old boy saved my life at Gettysburg. Dragged me 2 miles to the field hospital with my leg half shot off. The horse snorted as if acknowledging the story. He seems to know what you're saying, Abigail observed. Sometimes I think he does. Calvin's voice softened. More human than most humans I've known. Abigail noticed how gently he treated the animal, a stark contrast to the hardness he showed the world. Rosalind's remedy seems to be helping with your leg. Calvin nodded, a hint of surprise in his expression. It is. Never put much stock in folk medicine, but, he shrugged. Can't argue with results. He was, Abigail confirmed. Rosalind knows things about medicine that would astonish most doctors. You should let her help. Calvin considered this, then changed the subject. You've decided to stay. It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. For now, you're right. This is the safest place until we determine our next move. And what is your next move, Miss Mason? She leaned against the stall door, studying him. I'm not entirely sure yet, but it involves ensuring Blackwood never gets his hands on my father's discovery. Even if that means destroying it? The question caught her off guard. So, I don't know. My father believed the Mason crystal could save countless lives. Using it for healing was his dream. Dreams can turn to nightmares in the wrong hands. Calvin's voice was soft but carried the weight of experience. Sometimes the price of keeping something good out of evil hands is sacrificing the good itself. The words hung between them as the last light of day faded from the barn's small windows. Abigail felt the truth in them, but resisted it. There had to be a way to honor her father's work without enabling Blackwood's twisted ambitions. I should check on Rosalind, she said finally. Calvin nodded. Supper in an hour. As she walked back to the house, Abigail found herself reflecting on the unlikely sanctuary they had found. Calvin Montgomery was a complex man, damaged by war and personal tragedy, driven by a need for justice or perhaps revenge. Yet there was a fundamental decency in him that she couldn't deny. Whether that decency would be enough to save any of them remained to be seen. Inside, she found Rosalind organizing Calvin's kitchen, bringing order to the bachelor's utilitarian space. "You don't need to do that," Abigail said, though she knew Rosalind found comfort in practical tasks. "I want to contribute something," Rosalind replied, arranging dried beans in a jar. "And keeping busy helps me not think about everything." Abigail understood. The events of the past days, the kidnapping, their escape, Ray's death, seemed to exist in a different reality, one that was too painful to examine closely. "Calvin mentioned you offered to help with his leg." Rosalind nodded. "It pains him, though he tries to hide it. I noticed the way he favors it when he thinks no one is looking." She closed a cabinet door gently. "My father taught me how to create poultices for deep-seated pain like that. I could help, if he'd let me." "I think he might," Abigail said. "Eventually. He's not a man who accepts help easily. Few strong people do." Rosalind's perceptive gaze studied her. "Including you, Abby." Before Abigail could respond, a soft thud outside caught their attention. Both women tensed, Abigail reaching for her gun. "Probably just Calvin," Rosalind whispered, though uncertainty tinged her voice. They waited, listening. No further sounds came. "Stay here," Abigail said, moving cautiously toward the door. She peered through the window first, seeing nothing unusual in the gathering dusk. Opening the door slowly, she stepped onto the porch, gun held ready but hidden in the folds of her skirt. The yard was empty. The horses in the corral were calm, showing no signs of alarm. Wind rustled through the scrub brush beyond the fence line, the only movement in the still evening. Abigail was about to turn back when she noticed it, a small wooden box on the porch step. It hadn't been there earlier. Keeping her distance, she studied it. The box was simple, unadorned, about the size of a cigar box. There were no markings, no indication of who had left it or why. "What is it?" Rosalind asked from the doorway. "I don't know." Abigail looked around once more, seeing nothing suspicious. "Stay back." Using the barrel of her gun, she carefully lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a woman's gold wedding band. Beside it lay a small piece of paper with a single word written in elegant script. "Remember." A cold dread settled in Abigail's stomach. The message wasn't for her. "Rosalind, where's Calvin?" "Still in the barn, I think." Abigail picked up the box gingerly. "Find him. Quickly." Rosalind hurried toward the barn while Abigail examined the box more closely. The ring was simple but finely made, worn smooth in places from years on a finger. A beloved possession, not a random item. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Calvin strode toward the house, his face tight with concern, Rosalind following behind. "Rosalind says someone left something," he began, then stopped when he saw the box in Abigail's hands. All color drained from his face. "It was on the step," she explained, holding it out to him. "I don't think it's been here long." Calvin took the box, his hands surprisingly steady. When he saw the ring, a muscle worked in his jaw, but otherwise his expression remained controlled. "Elizabeth's wedding band," he said quietly. "She was wearing it when they killed her. It wasn't with her body." The implications were clear. Someone who had been present at his wife's murder had just been on his property, close enough to leave this memento without being detected. "The note says, 'Remember,'" Abigail added unnecessarily, "as if I could forget." Calvin's voice was barely audible. He closed the box with deliberate care and looked out into the gathering darkness. "They're watching. Have been all along." "Blackwood's men?" Rosalind asked. "Or Blackwood himself?" Calvin's hand went to the gun at his hip. "Go inside. Stay away from the windows." "What are you going to do?" Abigail asked, alarmed by the cold fury in his eyes. "Check the perimeter. Make sure they're gone." He handed the box back to Abigail. "Keep this safe." Before she could protest, he was moving toward the corral, his limp more pronounced in his haste. Within moments, he had saddled Sergeant and was riding toward the eastern boundary of the property, rifle in hand. Inside, Abigail and Rosalind secured the doors and windows, drawing the heavy curtains Calvin had installed for just such purposes. "Will he be all right?" Rosalind asked, worry evident in her voice. "I don't know," Abigail admitted, "but I've seen that look before, in soldiers who had nothing left to lose." She placed the box on the table between them, the simple object now charged with malevolence. Someone had come close enough to leave it without triggering Calvin's defenses. Someone wanted him to know they could reach him, reach all of them, whenever they chose. "This changes things," she said finally. "Staying here may not be the safest option after all." Rosalind's eyes widened. "You think we should leave? Where would we go?" "I don't know yet, but Calvin's vendetta against Blackwood may have just accelerated our timeline." Abigail fingered the crystal pendant beneath her shirt. "And I'm not sure we want to be here when it reaches its conclusion." Night settled fully over the ranch, wrapping the house in darkness broken only by the soft glow of a single lamp. Abigail took up position by the window, gun ready, watching for Calvin's return. Beside her, Rosalind waited silently, her usual warmth tempered by the gravity of their situation. The box containing Elizabeth Montgomery's wedding ring sat on the table behind them, a reminder that their pasts were not so easily escaped and that the echoes of old violence could still reach into the present with deadly effect. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the whisper of approaching storms, both natural and man-made. Something had been set in motion by that simple box, something that none of them might be able to stop. Calvin returned near midnight, his face grim. He had found nothing, no tracks, no sign of intruders. It was as if the box had materialized out of the darkness itself. "They're professionals," he said, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, "which means they'll be back. And next time, they won't just leave a message." The three of them sat around the table, the box between them like a malevolent presence. None of them suggested sleep. None of them believed it would come. "I need to know everything," Calvin said finally, looking directly at Abigail. "Everything about the crystal, about Blackwood's interest in it. No more holding back." Abigail met his gaze steadily. "Only if you do the same. Tell us everything you know about Blackwood, about his operations. If we're going to survive this, we need complete trust." Calvin considered this, then gave a single sharp nod. "Agreed." And so as the night deepened around Solitude Ranch, three strangers bound by circumstance and a common enemy began to forge something stronger than alliance, a bond built on shared pain and the desperate hope of redemption. Outside, the desert waited, silent and patient, and somewhere in that vastness, Nathaniel Blackwood's agents were moving, drawing closer with each passing hour. The coming dawn would bring difficult choices and dangerous paths, but for now, in the small pool of lamplight, Abigail, Rosalind, and Calvin found a moment of connection, frail as a candle flame, but burning nonetheless against the encroaching darkness. Dawn broke with crimson fingers stretching across the eastern skyline. The three of them had talked through the night, sharing everything they knew about Nathaniel Blackwood and his New Dawn Society, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Calvin had brewed pot after pot of strong coffee as they pieced together a common narrative from their separate encounters. Abigail's scientific understanding of the Mason crystal, combined with Rosalind's knowledge of traditional healing practices, painted a clearer picture of why Blackwood coveted both their families' knowledge. "He's assembling pieces," Calvin said, spreading his collection of notes and newspaper clippings across the table, "collecting different healing methodologies from around the world. Your crystal, Rosalind's father's herbal compounds, medical techniques from Europe." "But why?" Rosalind asked, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "Control," Abigail replied. "Think about it. Whoever controls healing controls life and death. Armies with soldiers who can't be killed. Workers who never tire. The rich and powerful living while the poor die of simple infections." Calvin nodded grimly. "And Webb's involvement makes more sense now. His wife is dying, some wasting disease the doctors can't cure. He's working for Blackwood because he believes the New Dawn Society can save her." "Can they?" Rosalind asked. "Maybe." Abigail touched the crystal pendant beneath her shirt. "With this and the knowledge of my father's research, it's possible." A heavy silence fell over them as the implications sank in. The crystal's power was real, and in the wrong hands it could upset the natural order of things in ways none of them could fully predict. As the first full rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Calvin stood. We need to prepare. If they delivered that box without me detecting them, they'll make their move soon. He walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. Inside was an arsenal that would have impressed a small militia: rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and even a few items Abigail recognized as military-grade explosives. I've been preparing for this confrontation for 7 years, he explained, seeing their expressions. Never knew exactly when it would come, but I knew it would. He selected weapons for each of them: a Winchester repeating rifle and Colt revolver for Abigail, who had demonstrated proficiency with firearms during their conversation, and a smaller, easier-to-handle Smith & Wesson for Rosalind. I don't think I can kill anyone, Rosalind said softly, looking at the gun in her hands. Let's hope you don't have to. Calvin's voice was gentle but firm. But if it comes down to you or them, I want you to have the choice. He led them outside into the cool morning air, where the world seemed impossibly peaceful. The sun cast long shadows across the yard. Birds called from the scattered mesquite, and a gentle breeze stirred the dust. Hard to believe that violence was approaching this tranquil place. First things first, Calvin said, all business now. Basic firearm safety and handling. Then we'll move to defensive positions around the ranch. For the next 2 hours, he instructed them with the patience and clarity of a born teacher. Rosalind, despite her initial reluctance, proved to have a steady hand and good eye. Abigail, building on the basics her father had taught her, quickly adapted to the more powerful weapons. When they broke for water, Abigail noticed how Calvin moved more easily, his limp less pronounced. Rosalind's treatment was having a noticeable effect. Your remedy's working well, she said to Rosalind. The inflammation is reducing, Rosalind replied with quiet pride. Another application tonight should improve it further. Calvin, overhearing them, gave Rosalind a small nod of acknowledgement, the closest thing to thanks his reserved nature seemed capable of expressing. She returned it with a gentle smile. The moment of connection was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching from the east. Calvin's transformation was instant. The patient teacher disappeared, replaced by the combat veteran. Inside, he ordered, positions we discussed. They moved quickly, Rosalind to the bedroom with its small window overlooking the eastern approach, Abigail to the main room with sightlines to the north and west, Calvin taking the kitchen with its view of the barn and southern exposure. The riders came into view, 5 men, led by Deputy Webb. Behind him rode Cooper, his arms still bandaged from Calvin's shot. The other 3 were strangers, hard-faced men with the look of professional gunmen. They don't have Blackwood with them, Calvin observed, his voice low. This is a test to see our strength, our resolve. Webb halted the group about 50 yards from the house. Montgomery, he called, got those papers you were so concerned about. Mind if we approach? Slowly, Calvin called back. Just you, Webb. The deputy separated from his group, riding forward at a measured pace. He stopped at the edge of the yard, making a show of holding up an official-looking document. Search warrant, signed by Judge Parker, authorizes me to search these premises for 2 fugitives wanted in connection with a murder in Copper Creek. Judge Parker's been dead for 2 years, Calvin replied coldly. Try again, Webb. A flicker of surprise crossed the deputy's face. Then his expression hardened. Don't make this difficult, Montgomery. We know they're in there. Hand them over and we all ride away. Simple as that. Nothing simple about handing 2 innocent women over to Blackwood's men. Tell your boss I know what he's after. It's not happening. Webb's hand drifted toward his holster. Those are serious accusations against a respected businessman. Could get you in a lot of trouble. I'm already in trouble. Calvin's rifle barrel appeared in the window, pointed directly at Webb. Now get off my property. A tense silence followed. Webb's eyes darted between the rifle and the house, calculating odds that didn't look favorable. This isn't over, he said finally, backing his horse slowly. Next time, we won't ask so nice. Next time, don't bother asking at all. Webb rejoined his men, exchanging words too low to hear. After a moment, the group turned and rode away, dust rising behind them. Only when they were out of sight did Calvin lower his rifle. That was too easy, he muttered. You think they'll be back? Abigail asked, joining him at the window. Count on it. Probably tonight. under cover of darkness. He glanced at the sun, already high in the sky. We have maybe 10 hours to prepare. The rest of the day passed in grim preparation. Calvin showed them the defensive measures he had built into the ranch over the years. Reinforced walls that could stop bullets, hidden caches of ammunition, escape routes through the cellar and out to a concealed ravine behind the barn. Abigail marveled at the thoroughness of his planning. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," he admitted. "Just tried to anticipate how they'd come. Give myself a fighting chance." As the sun began its descent, they shared a simple meal, perhaps their last moment of peace before the storm broke. The conversation was sparse, each lost in their own thoughts about what the night might bring. Rosalind broke the silence. "I need to prepare more of the poultice for your leg, Calvin, and some healing powders in case—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He nodded. "Use whatever you need from the garden. Abigail and I will finish securing the perimeter." Outside, the evening air had cooled, carrying the sweet scent of desert plants releasing their moisture. Abigail helped Calvin move water barrels to strategic positions, both for drinking and for dousing any fires the attackers might start. As they worked, Abigail found herself studying this complex man who had become their protector and ally in such a short time. Despite the gravity of their situation, there was a certain calm about him now, as if, after years of waiting, he was almost relieved that the confrontation was finally at hand. "You've been waiting for this," she said softly, "for Blackwood to make his move." Calvin secured a barrel against the side of the house before answering. Not just waiting, preparing, hunting his men, learning his operations. His eyes met hers. "But yes, in a way, I've been waiting for this day for 7 years. And if we weren't here? If it was just Blackwood's men coming for the land? Same outcome, different odds." He picked up another barrel. "Better odds with you here, actually. You're a good shot." It was as close to a compliment as he'd given, and Abigail felt a surprising warmth at his words. "What happens after?" she asked, helping him position the barrel. "If we survive this?" Calvin paused, as if the question had never occurred to him. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Never really thought past the confrontation." "You deserve a life beyond revenge, Calvin." He didn't answer, but something in his expression shifted. A brief glimpse of the man he might have been before loss and vengeance reshaped him. Their moment was interrupted by Rosalind calling from the porch. "I've prepared everything I can," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Healing poultices, pain remedies, even some powders that might help us stay alert through the night." As the sun touched the western mountains, they made their final preparations. Weapons were checked one last time. Water and ammunition were positioned at each defensive point. Escape routes were confirmed. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Night fell across the desert, bringing with it a heavy silence. The usual evening sounds, coyotes, night birds, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, were absent, as if the wildlife sensed the coming violence and had fled. Inside the house, they had doused all lamps save one, kept low and shielded from the windows. Calvin took the first watch, positioned in the small tower behind the house, with its commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Abigail and Rosalind waited inside, alert and ready. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Midnight came and went. The moon rose, casting silver light across the yard and creating deep shadows perfect for concealment. Just when the tension of waiting had reached an almost unbearable level, Calvin appeared at the door, moving silently. "Movement to the north," he whispered. "At least 6 men, maybe more, approaching on foot." Abigail felt her heart rate increase, adrenaline flooding her system. "Webb? Can't tell yet. They're being careful, spreading out to surround us." They moved to their positions, Calvin at the kitchen window, Abigail in the main room, Rosalind in the bedroom, each covering different approaches to the house. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, straining to detect any movement in the silver darkness outside. The attack, when it came, was not the frontal assault they had expected. A small object arced through the night, landing with a soft thud on the roof. Then another, and another. "Fire arrows," Calvin hissed. "They're trying to burn us out." The dry wood of the roof caught quickly. Within moments, the crackle of flames could be heard, and the acrid smell of smoke began to fill the house. The barrels, Abigail said, moving toward the door. Calvin caught her arm. It's what they want, to draw us out. If we don't put out that fire, the choice won't matter. He hesitated, then nodded sharply. I'll cover you from here. Go. Abigail slipped out the back door, staying low in the shadows. She reached the first water barrel and tipped it over, directing the flow toward the base of the house where flames were beginning to lick down the wall. As she worked, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from her head. She ducked, rolling behind the barrel for cover. Calvin's rifle answered, the sharp crack followed by a cry of pain from the darkness. He'd found his target despite the night. Abigail scrambled to the second barrel, aware that she was exposed. As she tipped it, another shot came, closer this time. She felt the wind of the bullet as it passed. Inside, Rosalind had taken up position at a window, her small revolver ready. When she saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness near the corral, she fired. The shadow stumbled, then fell. I hit someone, she called, her voice tight with shock. Keep watching, Calvin replied, his own rifle speaking again into the night. They're trying to circle around. Abigail had managed to douse most of the flames on one side of the house, but the roof was still burning. She needed to reach the rain barrel at the corner of the porch. As she moved toward it, a figure lunged from the shadows. Cooper, his face twisted with rage. He tackled her to the ground, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Got you now, he growled, hands closing around her throat. Abigail fought back, driving her knee upward into his injured shoulder. Cooper howled in pain, but didn't release his grip. Through darkening vision, she saw Rosalind appear in the doorway, gun raised. But she couldn't fire without risking hitting Abigail. With a final desperate effort, Abigail drove her fingers into Cooper's eyes. He reared back, loosening his grip just enough for her to twist away. She rolled, gasping for air, reaching for her fallen revolver. Cooper recovered quickly, lunging for her again. This time, Abigail was ready. Her gun came up, and she fired twice in rapid succession. Cooper jerked backward, a look of surprise crossing his face before he collapsed. There was no time to process what she'd done. The roof was fully ablaze now, and more attackers were closing in. Inside, Calvin shouted from the doorway, providing covering fire as Abigail scrambled back to the house. Once she was in, he slammed the door, barring it. We need to move. House won't be defensible much longer. The smoke was thickening, making it difficult to breathe. Through watering eyes, Abigail saw Rosalind gathering their prepared medical supplies into a satchel. The cellar, Calvin said, leading them toward a trap door in the kitchen floor. There's a tunnel that leads out to the ravine behind the barn. We can make a stand there if needed. As they moved, a new sound cut through the chaos, a man's voice amplified and commanding. Calvin Montgomery, this ends now. Calvin froze, his entire body tensing. Blackwood, he whispered, the name like a curse on his lips. Against all reason, he moved back to the window, peering out through the smoke. A tall figure stood in the yard, elegantly dressed despite the setting, his silver-streaked dark hair gleaming in the moonlight. Nathaniel Blackwood had finally shown himself. I know you can hear me, Montgomery, Blackwood called. The house is surrounded. There's no escape. Send out the women and the crystal, and I'll let you live. Calvin's knuckles whitened on his rifle. 7 years, he murmured. 7 years I've waited for this moment. Calvin, no, Abigail said, grabbing his arm. That's what he wants. We need to retreat while we can. The look he gave her chilled her to the bone, a look of absolute cold resolve. Go with Rosalind. Take the tunnel. I'll hold them here. We're not leaving you, Rosalind protested, coughing as the smoke thickened. This isn't a discussion. Calvin checked his ammunition. This ends tonight, one way or another. You two need to survive to make sure Blackwood doesn't get what he wants. Abigail saw the determination in his eyes and knew there would be no changing his mind. This moment, this confrontation with the man who had destroyed his family, was what Calvin Montgomery had lived for. At least take this, Rosalind said, pressing a small packet into his hand. For the pain, it will help you stay focused. Calvin nodded his thanks, tucking the packet into his pocket. Now go. The tunnel entrance is behind the root cellar. Follow it to the ravine, then head west. There's a line shack about 5 miles out, stocked with supplies. Wait there. The roar of the fire was growing louder, timbers creaking ominously above them. There was no more time for argument. Come with us, please, Abigail tried one last time. Calvin shook his head. Some debts can only be paid in person. He looked at her directly, something softening in his gaze. It was an honor to know you, Abigail Mason. You too, Rosalind Chen. Now go. Live. With those words, he turned back to the window, rifle ready, every line of his body focused on the man standing in the yard. Abigail wanted to say more, to thank him, to beg him to reconsider, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she grabbed Rosalind's hand and pulled her toward the trapdoor. The cellar below was cool and dark, a blessed relief from the smoke-filled house. As Abigail closed the trapdoor behind them, the sound of gunfire erupted above, Calvin making his stand. "We can't just leave him," Rosalind whispered, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "We don't have a choice," Abigail replied, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "He's made his decision. We need to honor it by surviving." They found the tunnel entrance behind a false wall in the root cellar, a narrow passage shored up with timbers, barely tall enough to stand in. With one last glance toward the trapdoor, they entered the darkness, guided only by the small lantern Calvin had left for just this purpose. The tunnel was longer than Abigail had expected, twisting and turning beneath the earth. Above them, muffled by distance and dirt, they could still hear the sporadic crack of gunfire. Calvin selling his life dearly. When they finally emerged into the ravine behind the barn, the sight that greeted them was apocalyptic. The house was fully engulfed in flames, a pillar of fire reaching toward the star-filled sky. The barn, too, had caught, its dry timber burning fiercely. Silhouetted against the inferno were figures moving, Blackwood's men, closing in on the house from all sides. "We need to go," Abigail said, pulling Rosalind away from the terrible scene, before they checked the ravine. They moved westward, keeping to the shadows of the ravine wall, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that Calvin Montgomery was almost certainly making his last stand in that burning house. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when an explosion rocked the night, a detonation so powerful it shook the ground beneath their feet. They turned to see the house collapse in on itself, sending a geyser of sparks and flame skyward. The ammunition cache, Abigail realized, or the explosives, he must have set them off. "Taking as many of them with him as he could," Rosalind whispered. They stood for a moment, watching the distant flames, paying silent tribute to the man who had saved them, protected them, and now, it seemed, sacrificed himself to give them a chance at escape. Then, duty to the living reasserting itself, they turned and continued westward through the desert night. They reached the line shack Calvin had mentioned just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. It was a simple structure. One room with a small stove, a cot, and shelves stocked with basic supplies. More importantly, it had a corral with 2 horses, clearly left there as part of Calvin's contingency plans. Exhausted beyond words, they collapsed onto the cot, holding each other as the events of the night washed over them in waves of grief and shock. "Do you think any of them survived?" Rosalind asked, her voice small in the pre-dawn stillness. "Blackwood, the deputy?" "I don't know," Abigail answered truthfully. "That explosion was massive. Anyone inside or close to the house." She couldn't finish the thought. They dozed fitfully as the sun rose, both too overwhelmed to truly sleep despite their exhaustion. When they finally rose, they took stock of their situation. The supplies Calvin had prepared included food, water, ammunition, and even a small pouch of money. There was also a crude map showing the route to the nearest town, a 2-day ride to the northwest. "He thought of everything," Rosalind said softly, running her fingers over the careful pencil marks on the map. "He had 7 years to plan," Abigail replied, checking the horses in the corral. 7 years of waiting for a confrontation he knew would come eventually. As she filled the water trough for the animals, a movement on the horizon caught her eye, a lone rider approaching from the east, from the direction of Calvin's ranch. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Rosalind," she called, keeping her voice low. "Someone's coming." They grabbed their weapons and took positions behind the corral fence, watching as the rider drew closer. The rising sun was at the stranger's back, making it impossible to discern features. "If it's Blackwood or one of his men," Rosalind began. "We'll deal with it," Abigail finished, steadying her rifle against the fence post. "We've come too far to give up now." The rider continued to approach at a steady pace, not rushing, but not hesitant either. As the distance closed, details became clearer. A man slumped slightly in the saddle, the horse picking its own way across the desert terrain. There was something familiar about the silhouette. "Wait," Abigail whispered, lowering her rifle slightly. "That horse." As the rider came within 100 yards, recognition dawned like the sun breaking through clouds. "Sergeant," she breathed. "That's Sergeant." And the rider, battered, bloodied, but unmistakably alive, was Calvin Montgomery. They abandoned their cover, running toward him. As they approached, they could see the extent of his injuries. His left arm hung useless at his side. His face was blackened with soot and streaked with blood, and his shirt was soaked crimson around his torso. But his eyes were clear and alert, taking them in with unmistakable relief. "You made it," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "We thought you were dead," Rosalind cried, reaching up to help him dismount. He winced as they eased him from the saddle. "Almost was. Half the house came down on me when the ammunition went up." He coughed, a wet sound that spoke of internal damage. "Sergeant found me in the rubble. Good horse. Stubborn." They helped him into the shack, where Rosalind immediately began examining his wounds. The worst was a deep gash across his ribs, but there were also burns on his arms and back, and what appeared to be a bullet wound in his left shoulder. "Blackwood?" Abigail asked as Rosalind cleaned the wounds. Calvin's expression darkened. "Got away. Him and Webb. The explosion took out most of their men, but those two were hanging back." His hand clenched into a fist. "He saw me in the wreckage. Our eyes met. Then he turned and rode away." "Why wouldn't he finish you off?" Rosalind asked, applying one of her prepared poultices to his ribs. "Because this wasn't about me. Not really." Calvin's gaze found Abigail. "It's about the crystal, about what your father discovered. I was just in the way." The truth of his words settled heavily over them. Blackwood had been willing to destroy Calvin's life twice over, but only as a means to an end. The real prize had always been the Mason crystal and its extraordinary properties. "He'll keep coming," Abigail said, touching the pendant beneath her shirt. "As long as this exists, as long as he knows I have the location of the deposit, he'll never stop." "Then we need to make sure he can't use it," Calvin replied. "Even if he finds it." Rosalind looked up from her ministrations. "What do you mean?" "The world isn't ready for something this powerful," Calvin said, wincing as Rosalind bound his ribs. "Maybe someday, when men like Blackwood aren't around to corrupt it, but not now." Abigail felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her. He had believed the crystal could save countless lives, could revolutionize medicine and healing. But he had also understood its darker potential, which was why he had kept it secret, why he had encoded the coordinates. "We need to destroy the deposit," she said finally, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Make sure no one can use it. Not Blackwood, not anyone." "Can it be destroyed?" Rosalind asked. Abigail nodded slowly. "My father's notes mentioned that the crystal formation is unstable when exposed to certain chemical compounds. With enough dynamite placed correctly." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Calvin studied her, something like respect dawning in his eyes. "You'd do that? Destroy your father's discovery?" "To keep it out of Blackwood's hands, yes." The certainty in her voice surprised even her. "It's what my father would want. He believed in healing, in saving lives, not in creating invincible soldiers or extending the lives of the wealthy few." A silence fell over them as the magnitude of this decision settled in. Destroying the Mason crystal deposit would mean sacrificing a medical miracle, but it would also prevent a potential nightmare. "Where is it?" Calvin asked finally. "The deposit." Abigail hesitated, then reached for the crystal pendant. "The coordinates are etched here in a code my father created. It's in a hidden valley about 30 miles south of here." "Ironically, not far from where Blackwood wanted my land," Calvin said with a grim smile. "He was close, just looking in the wrong place." "We'll need supplies," Rosalind interjected, ever practical. "Dynamite, detonators, and Calvin needs time to heal before undertaking such a journey." "We don't have time," Calvin argued, trying to sit up and immediately regretting it. "Blackwood will regroup, gather more men. We need to move now." You'll be no use to anyone if you bleed to death, Rosalind replied firmly, pushing him back down. 2 days of rest, minimum. Then we can consider the journey. Abigail found herself smiling despite the gravity of their situation. Rosalind's gentle but immovable nature was exactly what Calvin's stubborn determination needed as a counterbalance. She's right, she told Calvin. Besides, we need to plan carefully. One chance is all we'll get. Reluctantly, Calvin acquiesced, allowing Rosalind to continue treating his wounds. As she worked, Abigail stepped outside, needing a moment alone with her thoughts. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, yet strangely beautiful in the morning light. Somewhere out there, Nathaniel Blackwood was regrouping, planning his next move. And somewhere else lay the crystal deposit, her father's greatest discovery and most burdensome legacy. The decision to destroy it felt right, yet the weight of it pressed on her heart. So much potential for good, sacrificed to prevent greater evil. She touched the pendant, feeling its subtle warmth against her skin. Perhaps some small samples could be preserved, kept safe until the world was ready. But the main deposit, the source that could be exploited on a massive scale, that had to be eliminated. Rosalind joined her outside a short time later. He's resting, she said. The wounds are serious but not fatal, as long as infection doesn't set in. My poultices should help prevent that. How long before he can travel realistically? 3 days would be better, but knowing him, he'll insist on 2. Rosalind smiled slightly. He's quite possibly the most stubborn man I've ever encountered. It's probably why he's still alive, Abigail noted. Stubborn enough to survive when others would give up. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Despite everything, the danger, the losses, the difficult decision ahead, Abigail felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't running, wasn't simply reacting. She had a plan, a purpose, and she wasn't alone. What happens after? Rosalind asked softly. If we succeed in destroying the deposit? It was the same question Abigail had asked Calvin the night before, and she found she had no better answer than he had. I don't know, she admitted. I've been focused on keeping the crystal safe for so long I haven't thought much beyond that. Perhaps, Rosalind hesitated, perhaps we could start something new, somewhere far from here. Use what we know, my father's healing traditions, your scientific knowledge, to help people. The conventional way. The idea took root in Abigail's mind, growing with unexpected speed. A clinic, she said slowly, combining traditional and modern medicine. It's what my father would have wanted, healing without the shortcuts the crystal offers. Rosalind's face lit up. Exactly. Somewhere Blackwood would never think to look for us. And Calvin? Abigail asked, glancing toward the shack where he rested. That would be his choice, Rosalind replied. But I think perhaps he needs a new purpose too, when this is over. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming fast from the northwest. Not from the direction of Calvin's ranch, but from the nearest town. Inside, Abigail said, her hand going to her gun. Wake Calvin. They rushed into the shack, where Calvin was already alert, reaching for his rifle despite his injuries. Riders, Abigail explained, peering out the small window. At least 4, maybe more. Blackwood couldn't have gathered men that quickly, Calvin said, wincing as he sat up, and they're coming from the wrong direction. As the riders drew closer, Abigail made out details that caused her heart to sink. They're wearing badges. Lawmen. Calvin cursed under his breath. Webb. He must have wired for reinforcements from the county seat. The implications were clear. With his position as deputy, Webb could have reported anything, painted them as dangerous fugitives, murderers, thieves. The approaching lawmen would have no reason to doubt a fellow officer's account. What do we do? Rosalind asked, fear evident in her voice. Calvin thought for a moment, then made a decision. You two take the horses out the back, head south toward the deposit. I'll stall them, make them think I'm alone. We're not leaving you again, Abigail protested. This isn't like last night, he insisted. I'm not planning to die here, but you need to get a head start. I'll catch up when I can. How? Rosalind demanded. On foot with those injuries? Calvin grimaced. I've survived worse. Trust me, this is our best chance. The riders were less than a quarter mile away now. There was no time for debate. The riders were less than a quarter mile away now. There was no time for debate. Through the small window, Abigail caught a clearer glimpse of the approaching party. Deputy Webb rode at the front, his posture rigid, face set in grim determination. But something about his expression struck her. A flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even torment. Webb doesn't look like a man leading a triumphant capture, she observed. Calvin joined her at the window for a brief moment. No, he agreed softly. He looks like a man being dragged by a current he can't escape. His wife, Rosalind whispered. How bad is her condition? Terminal, Calvin replied. Consumption, from what I've heard. Doctors gave her months at best. A muscle worked in his jaw. Blackwood promised Webb a cure with the Mason crystal. That's why he's doing this, Abigail realized, not just for money or power. Makes him more dangerous, Calvin said. A desperate man will cross lines others won't. He checked his rifle one last time. But also more vulnerable. He's not a true believer in Blackwood's cause. Just a man trying to save someone he loves. Could we use that? Abigail asked. Maybe, if I can speak to him alone. Calvin's eyes narrowed as he watched the approaching riders. There's still a lawman in there somewhere, a man who once believed in justice. I've known Webb for years. Before all this, he was a decent man. You think you can reach him? Rosalind asked. I don't know, but it's worth trying. He turned back to them. All the more reason for you two to go now. Give me a chance to work on him. 2 days, Abigail said firmly. We'll wait for you at the entrance to the valley for 2 days. If you don't come by then, we proceed without you. 2 days, Abigail said firmly. We'll wait for you at the entrance to the valley for 2 days. If you don't come by then, we proceed without you. Calvin nodded. Fair enough. Now go, before they surround the place. With heavy hearts, they gathered their essential supplies. Rosalind left additional medicines for Calvin, along with clear instructions for their use. Don't die, she told him fiercely. We've lost too much already. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Yes, ma'am. With a final glance back, they slipped out the rear of the shack, leading the horses quietly until they were hidden by a ridge. Only then did they mount and urge the animals into a gallop, heading south toward the hidden valley that held the Mason crystal deposit. Behind them, Calvin Montgomery prepared to face yet another confrontation, this time with men who should have been allies, corrupted by Blackwood's influence and Webb's lies. As they rode, Abigail felt the crystal pendant bouncing against her chest, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Her father's legacy, Rosalind's future, Calvin's redemption, and perhaps the natural order of life and death itself. The sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky as they disappeared into the vastness of the desert. 3 lives intertwined by circumstance and choice, bound together by a common enemy and a shared purpose. The final confrontation still lay ahead, not just with Nathaniel Blackwood and his New Dawn Society, but with the moral implications of the power they sought to control. In the end, Abigail realized this wasn't just about destroying a mineral deposit. It was about deciding what kind of world they wanted to live in, one where healing came through patience, skill, and natural processes, or one where those with power and wealth could cheat death itself. Her father had made his choice when he refused to sell his discovery. Calvin had made his when he stood against Blackwood, despite devastating personal loss. Now it was her turn to make that same choice, not just for herself, but for all those who would come after. As the line shack disappeared behind them and the unknown territory opened up ahead, Abigail found herself recalling her father's final words to her. Some discoveries are too important to belong to any one person or any one organization. She understood now what he had truly meant. Some discoveries were so powerful they didn't belong to anyone at all, not even to humanity in its present state. Perhaps someday the world would be ready for the Mason crystal, but not today. Not in a world where men like Nathaniel Blackwood existed. Today, the crystal's greatest value lay not in what it could build, but in what its destruction would prevent. And so they rode on, 2 women and 1 absent man, united in purpose if separated by circumstance. Their path lit by the desert sun and the quiet certainty that they were doing what needed to be done, whatever the personal cost. Behind them, the echo of hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the desert. Ahead, an uncertain future waited to be written by their own hands. The desert, impassive witness to countless human dramas across the centuries, kept its counsel, revealing nothing, promising nothing, but offering in its harsh and beautiful way the one thing they all needed most, a chance to begin again 1 year later. The small clinic on the outskirts of Willow Creek, Oregon, was nothing like the desert that had forged their bond. Nestled between towering pines with a view of snow-capped mountains, it stood as the physical embodiment of their shared promise, to heal, not to harm. Inside, Rosalind Chen moved among the patients with practiced grace, her knowledge of traditional remedies now supplemented by modern medical texts. The waiting room was filled with a curious mix of loggers, farmers, and Native Americans from nearby settlements, all drawn by whispers of the unusual healing partnership between the Chinese herbalist and the scientist's daughter. Abigail Mason looked up from her microscope as the door opened, admitting a familiar silhouette. Calvin Montgomery's limp was barely perceptible now, though the scars on his face would always remain, badges of survival from that fiery night in Arizona. "Mail day," he announced, setting down a stack of letters and newspapers. His role as protector had evolved. Now he managed the security and logistics of their growing practice. His military precision finding peaceful purpose in organization rather than defense. Abigail sorted through the papers until she found what she was looking for. A small article tucked into the back pages of a San Francisco newspaper. Mining magnate Nathaniel Blackwood committed to Holbrook Sanitarium after bizarre claims of immortality crystals and healing conspiracies. Business empire and receivership following fraud investigations. Calvin read over her shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Justice comes in strange forms," he said finally. "Was it worth it?" Abigail asked, not for the first time. "Destroying something that could have helped so many?" "We didn't destroy healing," Rosalind answered from the doorway, herbs bundled in her apron. "We just chose the harder path, the human path." That evening, they sat on the clinic's wide porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. So different from the harsh Arizona terrain where they had met, yet the sky held the same vastness, the same promise. A young girl with a splinted arm ran across the yard, her mother calling after her. Nearby, an elderly man dozed in a rocking chair, recovering from pneumonia that would have claimed him without Rosalind's care. Calvin looked at the scene with quiet satisfaction. "Elizabeth and James would have liked this place," he said, words that would have been impossible for him to speak a year earlier. Abigail touched the spot where her crystal pendant had once hung. Sometimes she still felt its phantom weight against her skin, a reminder of what they had sacrificed. But as she watched Rosalind teaching a local woman to prepare a healing tea, as she saw Calvin carefully whittling a toy for a patient's child, she knew they had preserved something far more precious than any mineral. They had preserved the human capacity for compassion, for connection, for healing that came not from miraculous crystals, but from the slow, patient work of hands and hearts. The desert had taught them how to survive. But here, in this green valley, far from where their paths had first crossed, they were learning something even more important: how to live.